Hello and welcome back to the Stronger Than Steel podcast. My name is John Kier, and today I'll be doing another solo episode looking at the Pittsburgh Steelers defensive line, both at that position and some prospects heading into the NFL draft coming up this week. So first, let's take a look at the current position outlook. You have two guys in Cameron Hayward and Stephon Tuitt as the starters, L.T. Walton as the backup at defensive end, and Jason Fananka, I believe. Fanakia, might be how you say it, as the other depth option at defensive end. So what do the Steelers have here? You're probably wondering. Well, the Pittsburgh Steelers have two of the most underrated defensive linemen in the league, and Cameron Hayward and Stephon Tuitt. Hayward has been the leader of a good defense for the past few seasons and is a monster of a man, playing good in a run-stuffing position while also showing a great ability to be a strong pass rusher from a position that doesn't typically yield sacks. His performance against the Kansas City Chiefs last season in Week 4 may have been the most dominant performance by Steelers defensive linemen over the last few years. Stephon Tuitt struggled at the beginning of last season, but after a season-ending injury to Hayward, Tuitt stepped into the role of the veteran stalwart. In his third season, Tuitt became the full-time player we all thought he could be, which is essentially the equal of Cameron Hayward. At times, Tuitt might have actually been even better a player. While not as consistent of a pass-rushing threat, Tuitt is a more consistent run stopper and was one of the hardest hitters on the team, and is also one of the more consistent players on the team as well. Beyond him, you have L.T. Walton, who saw an increased playing time this past season and didn't disappoint. The former 6th-round pick held his own along the line and extended playing time off the bench this season and looks to improve even further. He's anticipated to be the 4th or 5th defensive lineman on the depth chart this season. So, who are some key free agent losses? That would be Ricardo Matthews, currently an unsigned free agent. Matthews was a solid depth option, but L.T. Walton may have surpassed him in ability this season, and with the acquisition of Tyson Alualu, he had no place left on this team, in my opinion. So, looking ahead to the draft and free agency need for this position, the free agency need was filled by acquiring Tyson Alualu earlier this offseason. A good spot starter and depth option for the position. He'll see a lot of playing time this season, and he can play both the run and the pass. The draft need is virtually non-existent since they have two great players starting and now two capable backups, one of which will be a young player approaching his prime, the other being a wily veteran in Alualu. So, on the off chance the Steelers do select one of these defensive ends, I decided to take a look at some potential prospects. The first one I looked at was Jerron Jones from the University of Notre Dame. An interesting tidbit about Jones, he actually attended Aquinas High School, which plays in the same section as my high school was. As a matter of fact, my team scrimmaged his when I was a sophomore and he was a senior, and we were all talking about him at the time. It's pretty cool when a local guy makes it big like he has. But anyways, Jones was a converted offensive tackle coming out of high school, but became a defensive lineman during his redshirt season in 2012. He played in 12 games in 2013 with one start, before becoming a starter as a sophomore. He had 40 tackles, 7.5 for a loss in his first season as a starter. He missed his entire junior season with an MCL tear, except for the team's bowl game. This season, he started 6 games and played in 12 overall, making 45 tackles, 11 for a loss, and had 2 sacks and 2 additional blocked kicks. He had a career game against the University of Miami, collecting 6 tackles for a loss. So looking at some of his strengths, Jones has great quickness for someone his size. This allows him to be a threat to penetrate the offensive line on running plays. He can change direction quickly and has good reach with his long arms. He can play both sides of the line and has a great explosive step off the line. He can move up the field well as a pass rusher and has been used as a nose tackle before, but operates best as a 3 or 5 technique lined up over the guards or tackles. According to scouts, he has a quote-unquote dominant potential. According to scouts, he can be a little coached up on talent and has 4 blocked kicks with an injury-shortened college career. So looking at some of his weaknesses, Jones has a weaker than desired lower body. He can be moved out of his gap because of this and comes off the ball a little too tall. He needs to have a more consistent bend while attacking the line of scrimmage. and his poor pad level upsets his balance when he's hit by a block head-on. His character and motivation have been questioned in the past. According to scouts, he did not use the offseason to get better when he was at Notre Dame, and he was reportedly disinterested in working to get better. Injuries have stunted his growth as a player and his overall production. So bottom line, Jerron Jones is a talented and athletic player at his position who has the potential to become a solid NFL player, but his lack of motivation and interest in improving, along with his injury-riddled past, will make it difficult for teams to want to spend a higher to even mid-round draft pick on him. But if he changes his mindset and gains some lower body mass along with improving his technique, he could become a very good NFL starter in any defense. He's kind of the definition of what you'd call a boom or bust pick. So moving on to my second player, Eddie Vanderdoes, I believe is how you say his name. A former 5-star recruit from California at 6'3" and 305 pounds. He played in 13 games his freshman year while starting 7. He became an all Pac-12 and freshman All-American honors with 38 tackles and 4.5 for a loss. He was an honorable mention pick again in 2014 as he started 12 games and added 50 tackles, 5.5 for a loss, and 2 sacks. He tore his ACL in the opener of his junior season after having a great game against the University of Virginia, but returned to form somewhat, starting 12 games last season, making 28 tackles, 1.5 for a loss, and earning all Pac-12 honors for the third time in his career. So looking at some of Vanderdoes' strengths, his best game was against Virginia his junior year, and it showed just how great he can be with 8 tackles and 2 for a loss in a game that he didn't even play all of. His body type has yielded some surprising athleticism. He has solid lateral movement and change of direction, has quick feet that allow him to spin out of a block. He has good chase along the backside of the play, powerful hands, and explodes into blockers with his hips, allowing him to disengage from the block, and he can play either the nose tackle or a 3 technique, but in any case, he can be a 2-gap responsibility player. He plays double teams pretty well and doesn't allow for cutback lanes, which is hence why he can be a 2-gap player. He has toughness and an edge to his physical play. He's a better pass rusher than originally expected or than his stats will tell you. He can push interior linemen way back into the pocket, and that's something that most scouts were surprised when they were looking at him. So some of his weaknesses: Vanderdoes missed nearly his entire junior season with an injury and didn't seem to bounce back completely last season. He doesn't carry weight well in his upper body and his midsection. He added too much weight last season and needs to lose about 15 to 20 pounds to play at an optimal level. He was slow in his reaction time off the snap of the ball and gets behind against angled blocks. His poor pad level after the beginning of the play. He has poor conditioning and needs to lose weight to regain mobility. His sack production should be better than it has been over the past few years. So bottom line, Vanderdoes is a solid option at the defensive end position, and he looked pretty good in 2014 and for the one game he played in 2015. He did show flashes of his former self last season, but was not quite at the level that he was hoped to be. He is athletic and powerful, but he needs to lose weight, and the question marks about his knee are definitely a concern. If he does do that, he could become a disruptive force on a defensive line. If not, his ceiling is that of a rotational defensive lineman, which certainly isn't that bad on its own. Most mock drafts I've seen have him going between the 3rd and 4th rounds. So if I had to rank the 2 defensive end prospects I just looked at, Eddie Vanderdoes definitely has to be the top or more preferred defensive lineman in my opinion. I just think that his potential as a pass rusher and the fact that he played really well and hasn't even been at his best yet shows that he's the better option, especially when you consider Jerron Jones's questions about his motivation and his willingness to be willing to improve in the offseason, which is something that's definitely going to happen every offseason. He's going to have to be fully committed, and I think teams aren't going to want that, and I know the Steelers aren't going to want something like that out of one of their draft picks. So moving ahead, the defensive end depth chart in 2017, it's pretty much set in stone as the starters being Cameron Hayward and Stephon Tuitt. In sub-packages, I have Javon Hargrave being the backup, followed by Tyson Alualu and LT Walton. I don't see the Steelers making a selection at defensive end here. really just don't think it's necessary. So, moving on to the defensive tackles, some of the defensive tackles the Steelers have, they have Javon Hargrave, Tyson Alualu, Daniel McCullers, Johnny Maxey, and a few other practice squad players. So, what do the Steelers have at this position? Well, starting with Javon Hargrave, the rookie third-round pick last year from South Carolina State. Hargrave was kind of, I don't want to say invisible in the early part of the year, but he definitely wasn't a great player at that time. Once Cameron Hayward went down, he had to step in as kind of the number 2 defensive lineman, and he showed some promise. There were times that he played really well against the run and actually showed ability as someone who could rush the passer. He's not the best defensive lineman out there but by any means, but he's definitely a solid player there's good reason to believe he's going to improve this year, and that's definitely very exciting. So moving on to the second defensive tackle I have here is Tyson Alualu, one of the key free agent pickups for the Steelers this year. A former first-round pick for the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2010. He had a pretty productive career with the Jaguars, and although he's not really a starter at this point, he's someone that honed in his pass rushing skills while he was in Jacksonville to add on to someone who was already a pretty solid run stopper. Alualu bolsters the depth at this position and actually makes the defensive line one of the stronger positions on the defense now, as opposed to last season when the Steelers were struggling with depth. Adding in Daniel McCullers, the number 3 defensive tackle right now. McCullers was actually the biggest player drafted in I believe it was the 2013 draft, standing at 6'7". He's a big man that hasn't developed quite the way the Steelers have wanted him to. He's on his final year of his rookie deal, and unless he shows something pretty big this season, there's no reason to believe that he would be extended. And he actually might not even make it out of training camp, so time will have to tell, but there's still some hope for him. Johnny Maxey is the only other NFL player with experience, and he played a little bit last year, including the Christmas Day game against the Ravens. Showed some interesting things, but bottom line is he's probably more of a practice squad player at this point with the chance to improve. So, we can move right into the prospects, and I only have one because the Steelers... Well, the 3-4 position, nose guard position, is kind of dying out a little bit. There are more defensive tackles that are more well-versed that could play both nowadays. So the Casey Hamptons of the world don't really exist anymore. So I looked at someone like someone that would be more qualified to play both a 3-4 defensive tackle and a nose guard. And when you consider that, and you also look at the fact that Javon Hargrave and Tyson Alualu can basically play defensive tackle and defensive end in a 3-4. It's not likely the Steelers would keep more than 3 on this roster, and when you consider that Daniel McCullers only has 1 year left, you don't really think the Steelers would need to draft one, but be that as it may, I decided to look at one more defensive lineman prospect, and that's Ryan Glasgow from the University of Michigan. Standing at 6'3" and 302 pounds, he comes from a large football family, including his brother Ryan, who's currently a guard for the Detroit Lions. He was the second team All Big Ten honors last season and was the team's defensive lineman of the year last season. He had 39 tackles, 9.5 for a loss, and 4 sacks. He had a pectoral muscle injury his junior year, but was a primary starter for each of the last 3 seasons. So looking at his strengths, he's a former walk-on prospect with a blue-collar mentality and demeanor, giving him a strong work ethic. He's a willing and strong fighter in the trenches and never takes a snap off. A muscular and rugged player, he has a solid frame and uses all of his muscle mass, which is good muscle mass. He has a powerful upper body and uses it as a weapon in his arms when trying to be disengaged from an offensive lineman. He uses a good push-pull technique along the line and is a technician as an interior run defender. He has a wide base and shows good balance. He can play against a double team and is a powerful tackler. He can also play a 2-gap scheme and can force his way past blockers and is a strong competitor. Some weaknesses, though, he really could take on more lower body strength to better combat double teams at the NFL level, which he is going to face. A stronger offensive lineman across from him is going to likely make life difficult for him and could neutralize him. He's not a natural knee bender, which is going to limit his athleticism, particularly while rushing the passer. And getting into that a little more, he lacks a pass rushing skill set completely. He doesn't have the talent and he doesn't have the skills to be an elite pass rusher, and he doesn't use his hands as well as he should. Unlikely to be used in pass rushing situations ever, so he's likely a two-down player. So bottom line, Glasgow is a strong, tough, and dependable player when he was at the University of Michigan. He's a willing participant in the dirty work along the defensive line and has an approach to the game that should interest some NFL teams, but his problems as a pass rusher are likely going to relegate him to a day 3 selection. Most mock drafts I've seen have him going late in the draft between rounds 5 and 7. So that's it for the defensive tackles. So I'll just do the defensive tackle depth chart here. First, as the starter, I have Javon Hargrave, followed by Tyson Alualu. And depending on what the Steelers do, if they keep LT Walton, I suspect he would be the third stringer there. And should they keep 6 defensive linemen, which they might, but I wouldn't be surprised if they don't. The third defensive tackle I expect them keeping would be Daniel McCullers in what would likely be his final season with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So, that concludes this brief episode about defensive lineman prospects. Again, don't really think the Steelers are going to need to look at this position considering the strong starters and the depth that they acquired at this position with the signing of Tyson Alualu. There isn't really much more to say. I mean, they could take one, but I'd be shocked if it's anything earlier than round 6. So they have other more important needs to attend to first. So that does it for this show today. If you have any questions about the show or any feedback to offer us, please email us at strongerthansteelpodcast@gmail.com. If you have any interest in following our show, check us out on Twitter and Facebook. Our username on Facebook is at strongerthansteelpodcast. On Twitter, our handle is stronger_steel. Check us out there for Steelers news as well as updates about our episodes. And we also post our episodes on SoundCloud and YouTube under the name Stronger Than Steel Podcast. Steeler Nation, thank you for joining me today, and we'll be back with episode 8. Austin will be rejoining me. We'll be talking about the inside linebackers, a big position of need. And don't forget, the NFL draft is coming up this weekend. This Thursday. The NFL draft is going to be starting. Remember, it's 3 days, and boy, biggest event of the NFL offseason coming up, and I can't wait. So, good night, Steelers Nation.